Today, we'll talk about the redefinition of death that took place in the late 1960s and 1970s. You may think, why are we talking about this issue? There are lots of controversial issues about sanctity of life questions that seem much more, I don't want to make a terrible pun, but much more live issues today, like abortion, like euthanasia and physician-assisted dying and so on. So why are we talking about something that seems to be settled, on which there seems to be a consensus, which we don't have a lot of legislators trying to change the definition of death at the moment, let alone protests outside hospitals that are operating with the definition of death. So why talk about it? Well, I think it's a really interesting thing that happened, and I think that if we do look at what happened, we see that it forces us to think clearly about what it is that we really value in human life. And if we're going to talk about, as some people do, the sanctity of human life and when we ought to be maintaining and protecting the sanctity of human life, and whether it's wrong to not maintain that in some circumstances, then it's obviously really important to know what it is that we value about human life. So that's one major reason for talking about this. Another is that it's actually, I think, historically quite an interesting process that this change did occur, and it makes a contrast to other issues that we are debating at the moment around this topic. So, let's go back to 1968 and to the way in which death was defined then, and had been defined for as long as people had been talking about death and thinking about the definition of death, or at least I suppose this definition required them to understand such things as the circulation of the blood. So maybe a definition like this might go back to something like the 17th century. But the basic idea, I think, was always there. So this is a standard law dictionary in 1968, Black's Law Dictionary, defines death as the cessation of life, okay? Ceasing to exist, defined by physicians as a total stoppage of the circulation of the blood. Cessation noted the word animal and vital functions consequent thereupon, like respiration, pulsation, and so on. So that was the accepted definition until that time. Now, why did that change? Well, undoubtedly, it's not a coincidence that this changed around the time that organ transplantation was becoming possible. In the 1960s, already a couple of years before this, people started transplanting kidneys and showing that kidneys could be transplanted and that somebody who was suffering from kidney failure could get a kidney. Now, in the case of kidneys, you can wait until the patient is dead by this definition. That is, you can wait until the heart has stopped beating, and the kidney is still okay to transplant. You can still remove the kidney after the heart has stopped beating, and you still have a viable kidney that you can transplant to someone else. But just around this time, Dr. Christian Barnard, a famous South African surgeon, performed the world's first heart transplant. And with the heart, if you do wait for it to stop beating, then it does deteriorate. The heart muscle deteriorates if you wait for it to stop beating and then transplant it. So although the first transplant was not very successful, the patient lived only 18 days, other surgeons then started doing transplants, and it looked like, and indeed it was, as it turned out, a promising surgical procedure that could save the lives of people whose heart had failed and who otherwise were certainly going to die. So there was a lot of excitement and interest in the possibility of doing heart transplants, and of course in getting hearts in the best possible condition to do those transplants. as a result of that development, let me just give you this a little one. This is since we're talking about the 70s, I thought I would give you my favourite definition of death. Some of you may know Monty Python, the British comedy team from that time, and John Cleese. So if you want an account of what really constitutes death, at least for the Norwegian blue parrot, have a look at this. You can find it on YouTube. If you Google Monty Python and dead parrot sketch, you'll get the whole thing. Point is, John Cleese is a character who bought a Norwegian blue parrot from this pet shop, and when he got home, he found it was dead. He brings it back to the shop owner, who says, no, it's just, it's not moving because it's pining for the fjords. And John Cleese then expostulates that, no, it's not pining for the fjords. It is, as he says, an ex-parrot, and he goes into this long thing. I've just given you a bit of it. I couldn't fit it all on the slide. It's a late parrot. It's a stiff. It rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, it would be pushing up the daisies, rung down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. It's an ex-parrot. So very clear idea of what is death here that you get from this philosophical authority. And note particularly the idea that it's a stiff, right? When you're dead, your body goes stiff. Applies to parrots as well as to us. So that seemed to be a clear account of death. But, as I said, around the time that heart transplants were becoming possible, this man, Henry Beecher, who was a noted physician with an interest in ethical questions, wrote, attached to Harvard, wrote to the dean of the Harvard Medical School saying that you should set up a committee to re-examine the notion of death. And the dean did that, and it was known as the ad hoc Committee of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death. You can refer to it as the Harvard Brain Death Committee, if you like, for short. The body completed its work rather quickly. So by August 1968, it had reported, that's in your reading, the report, and it starts out by saying this: our primary purpose is to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. That's unusual language nowadays anyway, because most people would say, if you're in a coma, you're not dead. So that's a contrast between the two. And we would distinguish now, even though we've accepted this idea of brain death, we distinguish coma, even irreversible coma, from brain death. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later on in the lecture. So the language that they use has changed anyway, for various reasons. So having said this, the committee in its report then said something about why we need this new definition. And it gave essentially two reasons. There's this one, which is about how now we can maintain the bodily functions, let's put it that way, of people who've had very severe injuries. Improvements in resuscitative and supportive measures. Really what he's talking about is the use of the respirator, which actually had been around for about 10 years by this time. But the mechanical respirator was able to maintain bodily functions in people, some of whom were certainly irreversibly damaged. Now, obviously, the respirator is an extremely useful device, and very often people come in severely injured. You put them on the respirator because they can't breathe on their own, and they recover in days or weeks or perhaps months. They recover and they walk out of hospital completely recovered and able to resume a normal life. So respirators are very useful. But sometimes this committee is saying these efforts to revive people have only a partial success, and what we have is an individual whose heart continues to beat but whose brain is irreversibly damaged. Now again, the language is interesting, considering that they are going to go on to define these cases as patients who are dead, right? They say the burden is great on patients who suffer permanent loss of intellect. Well, if you're dead, or even if you've suffered permanent loss of intellect, at least assume we're talking about complete loss of intellect, that is, or complete loss of consciousness, intellect again might not be quite the right word, it's hard to see how you're actually under a burden, how you're suffering. The other burdens they mentioned certainly are true. It's a burden for your family. If your body is still functioning in a hospital, they can't really grieve for your death. They can't go through the usual rituals, the funeral, and try to get over your loss because you're still there in hospital. They may still come and visit you. So there is a burden there. There's clearly a burden on the hospitals, a burden of paying for the maintenance of this patient, taking up an intensive care bed in the hospital, and on those who need hospital beds already occupied by these patients. They can't get into the intensive care unit perhaps because they're already occupied. So the other burdens are undoubtedly true. But if you're saying that someone is dead, or if you're about to say that someone is dead, it's very strange to say that they are suffering under a great burden. And these sort of ways of thinking are interesting because it makes you ask, are they really thinking of these patients as dead, if that's what they're saying? But then they had a second reason, and that relates more to what I was saying about transplant. Obsolete criteria, they said, for the definition of death can lead to controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. And obviously, if you do want to obtain organs for transplantation, you don't want to have controversy. You don't want to have doctors saying, I don't know if I can take this organ, because then often they won't. They'll worry about getting sued by the family of the patient. In fact, in an earlier draft of the report, which we now have because it was put into the Harvard archives and is now available for scholars to peruse, in an earlier draft, it read like this: there is a great need for tissues and organs of the patient whose cerebrum has been hopelessly destroyed in order to restore those who are salvageable. So this statement clearly contrasts the idea of those whose cerebrum has been hopelessly destroyed and you can't restore them with those who are salvageable. Looks like a trade-off of the two. Now that draft was sent to the dean of the Harvard Medical School who'd appointed the committee, and he advised against this language. He said, this language makes it look as if you're redefining death in order to obtain more organs to save people's lives. And wouldn't it be better to speak in terms of clarifying the criteria for doing this? Which, as you just saw, is exactly what the committee did. They took that advice. But this was clearly their original thought, and it looks rather like they changed the language because they thought it was politically unwise, perhaps, to be as clear in their statements of the reasons for the change they were making as this statement is. Okay, so the result of that report was generally accepted, although people thought, well, it needs some tidying up, as I mentioned, the language. Eventually, President Carter appointed a commission for the study of ethical problems in medicine, and it looked at the definition of death, and so it came up with this definition, which is pretty much the one that is used in this country, I think in all states of this country, and something like it is now used in almost every other country, although a couple of countries do have slightly different language. But you can see here the idea is that we now have two ways in which you can be dead. There's the traditional way, irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or, so even if your heart is beating, your circulation is going and so on, you're breathing, or if all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, have irreversibly ceased to function, then you're dead. And the determination should be made in accordance with accepted medical standards. They said that because, of course, the best medical standards for determining whether your brain has irreversibly ceased to function are going to change over time. You don't want to put them into law. So this is really what we have now in terms as far as the law is concerned. But there is a question as to whether we actually accept that this is really death, but I'll come to that in a moment. Why was this, you might say, why was this change not opposed by those groups that are strongly in favour of the sanctity of human life? Why was it not opposed? Well, one reason is that a decade earlier, in addressing a Congress of anaesthesiologists, Pope Pius XII had effectively said that the issue of when death occurs, the precise moment of death, is not one for the Church, but is one for doctors. The Church, of course, has its own definition of death, which, roughly speaking, is death occurs when the soul leaves the body. But that's not very useful for doctors in hospitals to determine when a patient is dead. So that actual determination, the Church said, is up to the doctors. And I think that was a significant factor in why the Church did not oppose this redefinition of death when it occurred. There's also, of course, the fact that, as the committee said, it seems to be, in a way, in everybody's interest to change the definition of death. It's in the interest of patients who can obtain organs. It's in the interest of hospitals who don't want their beds in intensive care units filled. It's in the interest of patients who want to get into those beds. And it's in the interest of families who can then grieve properly for their loved one. And on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be in the interest of anyone to have your bodily functions continued when you've irreversibly lost consciousness, when your brain has been destroyed. But that's those reasons, although they're there and although they're, I think, powerful in moving people, they can't really be reasons for the Church or people who hold a sanctity of human life view because they're too consequentialist. They're basically saying, well, if the benefits of taking the heart out of one human being and giving it to another are all on the side of doing that, then it's okay to do it. Given that removing the heart from somebody who is alive would be murder, you couldn't accept, if you believe in the sanctity of human life in the traditional sense, you couldn't accept that that was an okay thing to do. So you would need to have some other view as to why these patients whose brains have been destroyed, whose brain function has ceased, are really dead. In other words, that it's that it's in some way the old definition of death was mistaken, and the new definition is correct, rather than the old definition of death was inconvenient in various ways, and the new definition of death has great benefits. So what I'm saying really is, if you look at the report of the Harvard Committee, it seems to be saying the latter. That seems to be really their intention, that there would be great benefits in changing the definition of death. But that couldn't be sufficient reason for people who think that it's always wrong to kill an innocent living human being.